Yeah, I can. Can you hear me?
I am. We all can. Thank you so much for joining us, especially in such a kind of difficult and precarious time.
Yeah,
Sharon,
when we scheduled this, we never imagined that
right.
we thought it was the conversation.
That's exactly right. I think maybe, Sharon, maybe give us a 1 minute countdown. We're live? Wonderful. It's great when everything works out well. Good evening, everyone then at home, and good evening, everyone here in the room as well. My name's Liam Getreu. I'm the Executive Director of the New Israel Fund in Australia, and I want to welcome everyone to what promises to be a really interesting and, as you may just have heard Tamar say, a kind of unexpected conversation, obviously, given the moment that we're in, with Tamar Zandberg, a senior leader of Meretz in Israel, and Adam Bandt, the leader of the Australian Greens. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land here, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and paying my respect to their elders, past and present. Like I said before, we obviously didn't expect a few weeks ago when we launched this event, and Adam, when we started talking with you and Tamar a number of weeks ago about doing this, we didn't expect to be where we are now, in the middle of what is a major crisis, and probably the biggest crisis that we've seen in Israel, Palestine, and certainly the deadliest in almost 10 years. We've seen what began as the flaring of tensions in Jerusalem and on the Temple Mount, and with evictions in Sheikh Jarrah, has now become a full-on round of violence, with Hamas firing thousands of rockets into Israel, killing about a dozen Israelis, with thousands seeking safety in bomb shelters. And in Gaza, hundreds have died, including dozens of children, and we've seen enormous damage to buildings, roads, and other infrastructure. In Gaza, of course, Palestinians don't have Iron Dome. They also don't have bomb shelters to seek safety in. It seems, I think, in the last day or two that things have calmed down a little bit. And so we obviously hope that that will end soon, that everything will come up and wrap up soon. But a new worrying trend that we saw in the last couple of weeks was inside Israeli society, where mobs of Jewish and Palestinian Israelis have attacked each other. We've seen people be injured and killed as a result of that. And it's a bit of a breakdown of one of the most core foundational aspects of Israeli society that we work for at NIF, which is building a shared society between Jewish and Arab Israelis. And to see that threatened in such a visceral way is very disappointing and a little bit scary as well. I think not just for us who love Israel very much, but of course for the people on the ground even more so. We're definitely going to talk about all of that today. We also do still want to cover some of the things that we were originally planning on talking about with Adam and Tamar. We want to talk about the climate crisis. We want to talk about the state of human rights around the world. We want to talk about the tensions and realities of progressive politics in governments. The last thing I will say kind of before we get started, you may be able to see a little bit on the feed at home, is we actually have for the first time, Tamar, since you were in Australia almost 18 months ago, we have in the room real people. We have Adam, of course, obviously here in person. We actually have what looks to be 50 or 60 new gen people from our new gen community. Young professionals, university students, youth movement, madrachim. They're all here at Southside in Elstonwick in Melbourne to join the event. I'm sure many of you at home would have loved to have joined us as well if you could, and we're very sorry that as we kind of open up incrementally, we'll have more opportunities, but we wanted to start with a really nice, intimate New Gen event and to really celebrate the important role that this New Gen community has in NIF. We're going to get a lot tonight. You can ask your questions at home by typing them in the box. As you heard here earlier, you can scan the QR code if you're here, and we'll get to those questions. I really want to dive in first, just before though we start with this immediate crisis. Adam, I might get you to start and tell us a little bit about your personal journey. How did you come to be the leader of the Australian Greens? How did you become interested in politics? How did you end up where you are now?
Thanks, and thanks very much for the invitation. And I don't know whether to wave there or there to Tamar. Hi. It's lovely to see you again. And thanks everyone for coming along, and thanks so much to NIF for the invitation. Look, I grew up in a family where politics was discussed in a kind of a background way, I guess. My dad was the first person in his family to go to uni, and he went because education was free at the time and was able to go, but like no one else in his family did. It wasn't something that someone there would have done. And my mum was, I guess you would say, a practical environmentalist, and Christmas presents were always Wilderness Society calendars and things like that. And my first demonstration that I went on was against a nuclear-powered warship pulling into Fremantle, which is where I was living at the time. I actually joined the Labor Party when I was at high school, and then when I was at university, got involved in the education campaigns. You could see the cost of education going up and up and up to the point where someone like my dad wouldn't have been able to go to university again. So I left the Labor Party and was kind of just involved, I guess, as an activist for a lot of the time during university. I worked as a lawyer representing a lot of low-paid workers and clothing workers who are getting paid, like in the suburbs of Melbourne, getting paid $3 an hour to make clothes. I take big corporations to court to ensure they got paid properly. And I was a partner in a law firm, and then I heard about this thing called the climate change, the climate crisis, and I quit my job in 2007 and started running in elections for the Greens. Basically became sort of a climate convert at that time, and then got elected, and then the rest is sort of has been unfolding in the public eye.
It is, I think, a story that will also be familiar. Climate, I think, is a defining moment for a lot of people, particularly in this room here. Tamar, I want you to reflect on the same question as well, if you can. But I also want you to start getting to the heart of what's happening right now on the ground. So tell us how you are. Hopefully, I know we've been texting a little bit. It's nice to hear that you've been safe and your family as well. If you can talk a little bit about your journey and again, at this particular moment that we're in, and then we'll use that as a launchpad to talk about the rest of the crisis.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for the invitation. It is nice to see people crowded in a closed place. Actually, Israel, because of the vaccination, is getting more and more open, even I think more incrementally than any other place in the world. And still, I think it's very unusual, even for my eyes, to see people just sitting, just regularly around tables in a bar or a studio, whatever that is over there. Actually, here in Israel, the ban on people together changed very quickly from COVID to rocket danger. So now it is only allowed of 10 people together, not because of coronavirus, but because of the danger of rockets. And actually, one of my staffers, my assistant, is supposed to get married next week, and a wedding that was supposed to take place a year ago and was delayed 3 times because of the COVID. And now he and his future wife don't know whether they could hold the wedding next week. And it is very troubling times. And I think, Liam, this is just a very small example, but of course, people are getting killed on both sides of the border, and you know that Meretz and I know NIF support that idea, and of course the Greens. We support peace and talking and diplomacy over war and fighting, because we see that these rounds of violence and of war against Gaza that we experience every few years all of them end up exactly the same. Casualties on both sides, damage on both sides, the lose of hope and despair on both sides, and this is no different. And we call this morning actually again for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, and stop the war and stop the violence, and move to a path of talking rather than fighting. But then again, like you mentioned in your opening remarks, Liam, something that we are afraid of even more than the rockets of Hamas and another round of violence is the internal riots, I would say, and turmoil and unrest that has been going on for almost a week now. And this is actually a threat to one of the very basic things that we fight for and that we stand for here in Israel, and that is the joint life. The very basic idea of living together, Jews and Arabs in Israel, is now under threat of violence. And this is something that scares us much more than the war with Hamas, because, the war, you can end it, you can negotiate, you can use international mediators, you can shelter from it, but the texture of mutual life inside Israel, fragile and gentle as it is, if that is being torn apart, then this is a true existential threat to the future of Israeli society. So most of our energy and our time is being dedicated to, on the one hand, stopping the violence, and I can say that it's in a way kind of a little bit more quiet in the last day or two, but still very tense. And on the other hand, to enhance and to promote and to speak very, very loud for initiatives of joint life, for mutual joint demonstrations, standing together, Jews and Arabs, going to each other villages. We experienced both religious holidays, Shavuot on our Jewish holiday that ended yesterday, and Eid al-Fitr for the Muslim in Israel. So we try to create mutual events for the holidays, and this is something that we think through, and most of our energy and our time and our thoughts are how to bring the light stronger to defeat the darkness.
How would you describe the kind of political environment? It feels like in our Jewish community here, seeing what we're seeing on television and on social media feeds, it's very febrile even in our Jewish community. Calling for a ceasefire in the situation, in the political environment in Israel, I can't imagine is kind of at the top of the agenda of most people. How has the government responded to claims that, to you trying to pushing for a ceasefire? And how are people feeling? Are they feeling like this is a good, justified war? Are they feeling scared about what happens next?
Yeah, I think this is a very good question, and I want to address two aspects of politics. One is your question, how it is being received. And I must say that, we are kind of used to being a minority. And usually when the bombs are hurting the people and killing people, and people are in shelters, of course, it's not very common to listen to messages of ceasefire and of peace rather than war. But we are, as Meretz, we might be a minority on that, but I think it is our responsibility, and we are very proud of that even in hard times, we are that voice calling for, change of, I would even say, conception, because we feel that the Israeli government is trapped in conception vis-a-vis Gaza, that, like accepting that every few years it is like, it's like we are sentenced to go to these violent rounds every 3, 5, 7 years. It doesn't even matter. And we are the ones, even in those times, because between the violent rounds, it's like quiet. So why are you talking about Gaza right now? But when the rockets are hitting and the Israeli attacks are hitting Gaza, we feel that this is the right time to say, okay, what will happen in the next 5 years? How do we stop ourselves from reaching in 5 years from now to the same point again and again and again, like we did, 10 times in the last 15 years? And our answer is to change the concept from fighting to talking. And it's hard to digest that kind of a message right now, and I can tell you that we are attacked in social media, and maybe I can also tell you that even journalists, correspondents, journalists from Channel 12, which is the most popular channel in Israel, are now being guarded with personal security for expressing a kind of left-wing or left-leaning opinions or standings on the network, when the live studios and the live coverage is being given. So and my phone is bombed, and all of the Meretz and the joint list, Jews and Arabs, the ones that call for also ceasefire versus vis-a-vis Gaza, but also the ones who talk about the need for joint life within Israel. These are two fronts: the front versus against Gaza, and the front, the domestic front. I think it's times where, you know, the social networks and the comments that we get and the letters and the emails are very, very full of hate, I can say. But because, you know, that the I think it's a minority, but it's a very vocal minority that takes to respond and to curse and to strongly oppose every message of peace and cooperation at these times. But I also want to say one sentence about the other political situation vis-a-vis the government. You know that we had elections less than 2 months ago, and the new government was not formed yet. And actually, this is the fourth time that Netanyahu could not reach a 61 majority in the Knesset, that is 120 members. This time we tried to have some kind of a unity government, or a change government, like we call it, that will consist of some right-wing components that oppose Netanyahu, together with the center and the left, with the support of one or two of the Arab parties. But and we were very, very close. You mentioned, Liam, that we would like to also talk about the climate crisis. I was actually about to be appointed to the Minister of Environment in that government, in that planned government. But a few days after the crisis started, Bandt, the right-wing, not Netanyahu supporter component, declared that he is not willing to go to that kind of government in these times. And right now there is uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen. In 2 weeks, we might know if we will go to another election, fifth in 2 years, or some kind of another government could be formed that we don't know right now, because Netanyahu doesn't have a government, and also the other side doesn't have a government because the right wing would not go with the left and the center in the shed of the events. So this is also contributing to a very, very unstable and uncertain atmosphere in the politics.
Adam, how is that to kind of digest everything that Tamar said? Maybe the idea of shelving the climate crisis for a more kind of political expediency may ring a bell or two in your mind. But how do you reflect on what we are seeing now unfold in Israel-Palestine?
Yeah, look, I know the timing, you didn't have control over the timing for tonight's event, but I feel like I've come along to hear Tamar speak because this is fascinating, and this is... I want to say too, Tamar, thanks for being such an inspiration and a continued voice for peace, because we've got four pillars, and peace and non-violence is one of those pillars: social justice, grassroots democracy, and ecological sustainability. And I think you make the point really, really well that it is in the times of conflict that it is the most important time to be strongly calling for peace. And so and also just to let, I think it's worth you knowing too, Tamar, that this isn't what is happening at the moment in Israel-Palestine is not just being viewed here by a small audience. It is actually something that is occupying our daily news. It's a high level on the daily news bulletins. People are actively discussing what should be done about it and what role in particular countries like Australia could take. And so I hope, just to sort of throw something out there for you, I'd really be interested in hearing from you if you have a view about what it is that's useful to be done from places like Australia. Yes, the knocking of the climate crisis off the front page is also something that happened during COVID, and it's worth casting our minds back to the terrible, terrible summer that we all experienced. And if you experienced it living in a regional area of Australia, it was a direct threat to your life. If you were in one of the fire zones and people were fleeing and so on, And but also, even for us here in the inner city, like I remember during that summer, I would check my phone before I dropped the kids off at childcare to see, and the pictures of someone in a gas mask would be coming up because that's how high the pollution level was in our inner city. And there was a real sense that there was, I felt anyway, that we were on the verge of some significant action on the climate crisis, and that people understood that the government had not done enough and it had in fact fast-tracked the climate crisis, and Scott Morrison was really on the ropes during that time. And then along came COVID, and rightly we all dropped everything to deal with that. But it is significant how those events can kind of push it off the front page. But one of the things, and I think this is a point that Tamar is making as well, these underlying problems, whether it's around questions of coexistence and violence, or whether it's around questions of the climate crisis, which are questions about maintaining the conditions of life and ensuring that we're all able to have a good life, are not going away, and they're going to persist and continue to persist. And I think that, I hope that we do get to see you as the Minister for Environment and Climate. And I think we're starting to see that in various places around the world at the moment. We've got it over the ditch in New Zealand here, where we have a Greens in the Climate Change Ministry. And it feels like things are starting to turn. The cynic in me might say, well, isn't it amazing that when things are on the verge of happening, Conservative leaders find a way of trying to shift the conversation. And I feel that where we're at in Australia with the talking up of the rhetoric of the potential war with China, like a land war with China, like seriously, like is that what the government is now talking about? Like, are we headed to our own khaki election here in the same way, or not in the same way, but is that playbook going to be played out here? Is something that gravely concerns me, but I think having that underpinning of peace and non-violence is critical.
One of the underlying factors that triggered, I think, the violence more generally between Hamas and Israel, but certainly inside Israel, has been the rise of Jewish supremacy and of Kahanism. I know that the police chief in Israel, I think in a private conversation, attributed the kind of rise of this, he called it an intifada inside Israel between Jews and Arabs. He attributed it to Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's a Kahanist, now member of Knesset, who's gone around the community stoking these fears. And so we actually have a question on that in the audience that's come in from Maddie. So Maddie, unfortunately at home you can't see Maddie, but you just have to trust me, she's here. Maddie, do you want to go ahead and ask your question to Adam and Tamar?
Yes. Thank you both. Is this working? Yep, cool. Okay, I'll take your word for it. Thank you so much for coming, both of you. Really appreciate the time given the state of the world and whatnot. I also just want to quickly spruik that I'm also here in my capacity as the co-convener of the Jewish Greens Working Group, which does some amazing work internally within the Greens and within the Jewish community. So if that interests you, definitely let me know. We'll find our Facebook page or both. In relation to Liam's comment before, I think the current state of the world in terms of rising populism, rising white supremacy and far-right rhetoric is something that we see a lot of in Israel and Kahanism. Tamar, I note your recent time on a panel on live TV, and you rightly, I think, walked out on that after refusing to engage in that kind of sentiment. In Australia, in the last couple of months, we've even seen rising neo-Nazi activity in regional Victoria, which is really frightening. And in both contexts, we know that leaders on national levels are really fueling this, both in words and also in policy particularly. So I'd like to know what you both see as the reality of this far-right sentiment, and then also what are actual appropriate policy responses. Thank you.
There's two separate questions, two different realities that we face. Tamar, do you want to start and maybe give that short story about what happened on the panel with Ben-Gvir? That's, I think, that's a shining moment, a shining light moment.
Yeah, so thank you. So so on Friday, you know that in Israel, at least, whenever there are events like we see now, again, Gaza and the domestic event violence mixed together, usually they open like live waves that are broadcast, throughout the day in all the broadcast channels, and they bring, security experts and also Knesset members to express their opinions on the situation. And I was like, every day now, I will, by the way, in a few minutes, I will have a few minutes break from video. I will still hear and can talk, but I will have to move to the car to go to another studio to express our opinion and again call for a ceasefire. This is the main event of the day, but so excuse me in a few minutes. But on Friday I was on another live broadcast like this, and you know, like when we go on live, Adam, probably you know that too, and Liam, we ask who's going to be on the panel, who's going to be interviewing, who's going to be sitting with me, and everything was okay. And then after an hour, I'm sitting there. They try to bring Itamar Ben-Gvir in the same studio with me. Of course, I always ask who's going to be on the panel, and I never, and the entire Meretz, we never sit with him. We boycott his speeches on the plenary because he is a representative. You know, it's not because he's right wing and not because he's extreme, because he is Kahanist. And the Kahana movement was banned from running to the Knesset almost 30 years ago. And when Kahana was in the Knesset, one term after which the Knesset legislated the law that allows to ban on the basis of declared racism as a political platform, Prime Minister Shamir from Likud used to leave the plenary when Kahana spoke. And 30 years later, he's accepted as a legitimate representative, and also being very, very outspoken and very loud in the studios. And one of the NGOs had a count of the minutes of broadcasting in the last 2 weeks and found out that he was second only to Netanyahu in the minutes of broadcast that were dedicated to his interviews. And when I discovered he's about to go live, I just got up and left the studio in the middle of the live streaming. And I said, you know, there are many right-wingers, and I can argue with all of them. And I have hundreds of minutes of broadcasting, you know, shouting at them, and they're shouting on me, and debating. But Kahana is a red line that we do not want to normalize, and we do not wish to give legitimacy to. And right now, I am, for those of you who read Hebrew, maybe it will be translated to English later. I don't know, Liam, if you can distribute the link that I just sent. I wrote an open ad in Haaretz today explaining why Ben-Gvir is not like any other right-winger, why we will not sit with him. And I even compared it to Trump, when that was very, you know, insightful and provocative. And once it was clear that he's the cause of the violence, the studios and the social networks just banned his message, and he was blocked from all social networks, and he's still blocked until now. So I think that at some point, the open microphone that such a Kahanist is getting is we have to think to up to a certain point, is it, you know, being one of the reasons that his message, that his violent and incitement messages are being so widely distributed, and explained why he should be blocked from, or at least such a wide stage. And I think that message to the second part of the question, I think that message is not very, or yet, I mean, it is under debate, but I think that he's still being received or perceived as an extreme right. I think that it's not a matter of left and right. You know, there are many right-wingers in the Knesset. Some even say that maybe they're even the majority. But we act under the notion that racism is not a political platform, and Jewish supremacy and white supremacy is not something that you can advocate for. And democracy has its boundaries, and one of them is the notion that all men are equal, men and women are equal, and one man, one vote, and, you know, no one is superior to the other. Otherwise, this is not democracy, and this is not, you know, the rules of the game are distorted when we legitimize such racism as politics.
How does that play out in Australia? I mean, Kahanism is Pauline Hanson on steroids, and then on steroids again with guns and knives. Like, it's really a next level thing. But Pauline Hanson's role in the Australian political zeitgeist is still, and people like her, are still very toxic.
Still very toxic, and she gets elevated in a way that's disproportionate to the level of support that she has in Australia. I mean, to quick comparison, the Greens get between 10 and 12% of the vote. Hanson gets 2 to 3% of the vote, but only one of us gets a weekly slot on, nationally syndicated commercial television network. And like the amount of effort, in part because, her whole thing is to be racist and to be reported as being racist. But nonetheless, the level of attention that is given to her is really significant. It's an even more complicated dynamic than that, though, because in response to her continuing to do what she did, you had a Conservative government that just took on a stack of her policies in order to try and wipe her out. And then, so you now have this terrible dynamic where they're each trying to outdo each other all the time. As of yet, at least they haven't advocated sort of violent attacks, but, there's still... You remember that Hanson got that "it's okay to be white" motion through the Senate that the Conservatives, the Liberals, supported her and voted for as well. The other thing I'd say, answer to the question, is that far-right extremism is the greatest security threat in Australia at the moment, according, at least up until a couple of months ago, to ASIO. Like, they said, this is in terms of internal attacks, this is the thing that we've got to watch out for. They then came under sustained pressure to say, you can't call it out as being far right, and so now they've come up with this new term, which is politically motivated extremism. I think that's the name of the term. And I think that's really dangerous, that has been elided, because in Australia, I think it's got a very strong white supremacist component, but there is also, and this probably doesn't get a huge amount of coverage, but sort of my understanding from talking to people in the field is that there is a big anti-Semitic component to it as well. Like, they're explicitly, like, that part of it is, I think, perhaps going underreported, but is a clear component of it. So no longer calling it far-right extremism and instead having this general term, I kind of worry that we are taking our eye off the ball, perhaps under pressure, for political pressure, that means that now, like, I don't want to see a situation where all of a sudden a group pops up that is incredibly well organised and that is able to marshal some kind of political representation that makes Pauline Hanson look moderate, which is...
It is a scary thought, and like you said, that rebranding, this idea that the right has said, we don't want to call it far right just because people who are right-wing might feel infringed upon or might feel isolated is a very scary concept. Thank you for coming back to us, Tamar, in the car. I think this is the first time we've actually had a speaker join us from a hospital room before, but never, I think, from a car. So this is a first.
Car is one of the best place for Zoom conversations, because then it's a great use of time.
So I think that is maybe a good segue to get away from the very serious moment that we're in and talk about some of the meta questions. So, Adam, even though the Greens haven't been a partner in a formal coalition partner, you did have an agreement after the hung parliament in 2010 with then Julia Gillard, who was Prime Minister. My question more broadly is, how does a minor party in league with a larger party try to get things done? How do you balance questions of principle versus pragmatism, trying to push for things that are at the top of your agenda, but maybe you're trying to bring, in your case, Labor a little bit more to the left, how do you manage those things? How do you decide this we want to push for? No, that we'll leave on the back burner.
It was that 2010 election was a pretty good one. I mean, I remember getting elected that evening, and as the numbers started coming through in the evening, thinking, right, I got elected, and I promised myself that if I got elected, because it was the first time I got elected, that if I got elected, I was not going to have anything to drink. I was going to go home. I was going to have because things were going to get pretty busy the next day. So I actually didn't pay much attention on that election night to what was happening in the rest of the country. It was like, I better go home and witness that. And I still remember reading the papers the next morning and realising, right, I've won, but no other party has won. This is going to be very interesting. And checking my phone to find 2 voicemail messages, one from Julia Gillard saying, wanna talk? one from Tony Abbott saying, Adam, I've always considered myself an environmentalist, and could we perhaps sit down and have a chat? And I wish I'd kept it. I wish I'd kept that voicemail. It'd be worth a lot right now. But we sat down with Labor and said, look, we will support you, but we want a number of things in return. And two of the key things one was action on climate, and so we got a price on pollution and 13 billion for clean and renewable energy. And it's the only time pollution in Australia has meaningfully gone down was when Greens and Labor cooperated, because we also had balance of power in the Senate. And the second thing is we got dental into Medicare for kids. And for me, that's kind of unfinished business. I want to get that done for the rest of, for everyone else as well. I think we are headed towards another power sharing parliament at the next election, because at the moment there's basically, Morrison has a 2-seat majority. Those 2 seats are held by 828 votes. In other words, in total. So in other words, if 828 people had voted differently, the Greens would be in balance of power right now. And we're going to have a change. We've seen Craig Kelly sort of drop off, and potentially others as well. We are going to be, I think, and the flip side is it's going to be quite doable to push Morrison out. It's going to be much harder for Labor to win in its own right, because to do that they'd need a substantial swing, because there's 6 of us sitting on the crossbench now and potentially more. So I think we're heading towards another power sharing parliament. What principles do I take to that? It's very much, we know which direction you want to go, and you try and push the government to go as far in that direction as you possibly can. If you want to go 10 steps forward, if you only get to go 6, you take the 6, right? And you don't sort of say, I'm not going to do it because I can't take the 10. But what you don't do is start walking off in different directions. And so for me, it's a question of you get done as much of your platform as you can, recognising that it's not going to be everything. But so during that parliament, for example, we said, well, yeah, we'll work that, but we're not going to change our position on mandatory detention of refugees, for example. And I think that's, to me, when you look around the world and you look at the ACT, we've actually got Greens ministers in power sharing with Labor. So they have not a formal coalition arrangement, but something much firmer and much closer, where they sit in cabinet together in a way that we didn't in 2010. For me, all of those options are on the table. It's about getting something done and accepting you might not get everything, but you're going to be able to push them in a way that they won't do themselves.
How would Minister of Environment Tamar Zandberg cope sitting in a cabinet with annexationist Prime Minister Naftali Bennett? How would you have reconciled that and worked in that, what would have been a difficult environment? In the alternate reality where that would have happened and where we were only seemingly a few hours away from.
Yeah. Right. So I think I listened to Adam, and I think I can relate and really, find myself in his words, because I think Meretz is much like the Greens, for the left from the center left or something like that, and is a party that is being known and very famous for its ideological loyalty, and always, even our Israeli Labor has sat in right wing and even in Netanyahu government in the past, but Meretz never did that. It was very loyal to its ideology and its principles. And yes, we actually, for the first time in our more than 30 years of history in politics, found ourselves in a very, very bizarre, I would say, situation. And I can say that we, as the leaders, as the elected MPs, I can say that I think we had no doubt. And I can also reflect that our voters were very supportive of the idea that we would go to such a very non-unified government, starting from Bandt, going to Meretz, and even to the Arab parties as supporters, because we thought that, two reasons actually. One, we think, and our voters feel, that for a few years now, Israel is under a severe crisis. Democracy crisis, 4 rounds of elections in 2 years. And now there is a great chance that we're heading the 5th. and Netanyahu under severe corruption indictments, and that has to do with the policy that he shows, and the other reason is that Meretz is not part of the government and not part of a governing coalition for more than 20 years now, and all those years we have seen only right-wing government, and the opportunity to take part in government, in a government that would not have been, I don't know, I'm confusing the tenses in English because there's something that at least up until now didn't happen, but we were ready to take part in that and support that, because we felt that that this is the better option, that having Netanyahu, ultra-Orthodox and Kahanist, Ben Gvir, we talked about Ben Gvir before, in the government. So we said, yeah, you come to politics to influence and to give the best you can, and of course in light of your principles, but you know that you also need to compromise, and you can never, with 6 seats, and this is why I identify with Adam, those 6 votes can't change everything by themselves, but they can surely take part and influence in the direction that we're seeking. And by the way, the reason I was so excited for the climate and environment issue is because we thought that there were many controversial and things that are not accepted on all partners of that, imagined coalition. But climate, for example, or economy after COVID, or there are many issues on which those far ends can come together, and environment is one of them. And Israel is way behind in that issue if we compare it to the world, and of course to Europe, and even to the US under Biden, of course. And this is something that we thought that this is a field where we can show a lot of change. And so now we'll see whether we go to 5th elections or another somehow Netanyahu government, if some of the others would break and under the emergency will join him, or we don't know what's going to happen. So yeah, we prefer the other option, definitely.
How would you have got Israelis to care about the climate crisis? For something that is so not on the agenda of the Israeli political zeitgeist, how do you manage to insert that into the agenda? I mean, I'll start with you, Tamar, but Adam, the question is the same for you. How do you get people in regional Queensland who depend on mining for their livelihoods to understand that things have to shift? But Tamar, do you want to maybe start on how that would play out in Israel?
Yeah, so I think, as Meretz, we are used to being ahead of many, and usually many come after us. It was like that with feminism, for example. It was like that with the peace, and it's also like that with the climate change. I think that Israel and Australia, even though there are a lot of differences, of course, Australia is much bigger, and the location on the globe, but Israel is also on the shore and close to the desert, and has a land, border with Africa. So I think that Israel is much smaller and maybe has less influence, but it's also very vulnerable to climate change and refugees and a lot of what is derived from the climate change. So we feel that this is the time, even like you said, to inject, even though we are, the first ones and maybe the visionaries sometimes, and the ones that people call naive or I don't know what, but this is the right time to put those issues on the table, even if they will not become a consensus in a short time, but they will shortly after. We are sure of that, and we know this has happened to us many times in the past with other issues. So we are not afraid of being the first ones to take them.
Adam, how do you get people who voted in Queensland for Clive Palmer and Pauline Hanson to care about climate?
Well, before, a couple of years ago, I spent a fair bit of time travelling around Australia, going to coal communities, basically with part of a roadshow to have public meetings to say Greens want to quit coal. And here I'm coming into Lithgow or Muswellbrook, and our plan is to phase out coal, but I want to talk to you about what it would mean to transition in a way that supports you and supports your community. And so we were holding these public meetings in coal towns, right? And I think 10 years ago, if the Greens had gone in saying we want to shut down all the coal mines, come to our public meeting, I don't think it would have lasted very long. It would have been a very quick visit to that town. But these meetings were really well attended, and there were guys in high-vis vests sort of folding their arms, sort of like glaring at us from the front row for a while, and just explained, look, here's why we've got to get out of coal, here's the climate crisis. We now know things about coal that we didn't know before, and we're not saying it's anyone who's sitting in this room or in this town who works in the mine's fault. We just know things that we didn't know before, and we can't go on as we are. And I had people come up to me afterwards and say, look, don't agree with everything you say, but you're the only one telling us the truth. And I think that especially in Australia, I think that there's a high, people have got pretty good bullshit detectors, and I think that when you try and walk both sides of the fence, it doesn't work. But when you go and say, look, here's the reality, we've got a transition, I want to have a discussion with you about how we do it in a way that looks after you and ensures that you can have a secure job and continue to feed your family, people respect that. And we've also seen transition done really badly in Australia as well, and seen lots of jobs being lost as industries have shut down. And I think we've got a real opportunity to improve. So the last thing I would say is that in terms of how do we get it back on the agenda, I think the change of government in the US is really changing things in a way that I am pleasantly surprised by. I think Biden has been much more progressive on climate than I expected that he would be. I did not think we'd be sitting here in a situation where the United States government and the UK government were pressuring Australia to get out of coal. But that's where we're at. That is what is happening at the moment. And a report has just been released today from the International Energy Agency that represents a lot of these coal people, saying Australia needs to get out of coal by 2030. It is massive. It is happening, and it is happening very quickly. And we've seen with Hazelwood here what happens when you do it without a plan, and it's dislocation to people. So I think it's rapidly becoming we can't be an outlier anymore, and we're not going to have any friends if we try and continue to prop up coal. So it's going to be the party that says, let's do it in a way that looks after you, that is going to succeed.
We are coming towards the end of our conversation. There's two more kind of key themes I wanted to talk about. One is, Tamar, something that Adam flagged at the beginning of, how do you see, kind of zooming it back onto the Israel question maybe, how do you see the partnership and the role that Australia can play, and maybe Adam as a kind of ideological sibling as well? We're upside down. We're gone. Hopefully you can still hear us. There you are. What role can Adam play, and what can progressives in Australia play in supporting your cause? And the parallel, or maybe the flip side rather, of that is a question that we often get as NIF in Australia, and I think progressive and liberal Zionists often get, is lama bachul? Why do you want to talk about these things in Australia? Why do you want to air our dirty laundry abroad? So our answer is the partnership between progressives in Israel and progressives in Australia. But I want to hear kind of how you feel like that voice can be amplified even more.
Yeah, so first of all, I think that our partnership and our shared values on the one hand, and sense of faith, as the New Israel Fund and the Jewish and maybe even Israeli communities. I know that one of the, like you mentioned, that the last public event was with me about 18 months ago. And I think that my visit there was very important for me, both to meet the work that you're doing, the New Israel Fund, with the young people and the other Jewish and Israel supporters communities, but also with the Greens and the MPs that I met, that I think we found out how much we have in common, even with being, so far away. And I think that this is something that in Israel is not stressed enough. We like to think of ourselves as very, very unique, and like the political and social reality here is like nowhere else. And I think that finding people like us who support the same values and who sometimes tackle the same challenges is very, very important for us, for our communities, and for the sake of the public debate and discourse here in Israel. So for me, this is something that I use very often, and this is, like international perspective and experience, and I think that knowing that we have partners who support our views and our values, and also passing the message that Israel is not just the Israeli government and the way it is being viewed all over the world, but it's also Israelis. And maybe I can even say that after four elections, I would even say that I think our bloc, not just Meretz, but the entire bloc, has a majority and is even more representative than the Netanyahu bloc, but because of the way politics is built. Netanyahu is still in power, but it doesn't mean he represents the majority of Israelis right now, or in the last 2 years for that matter. So I think this is a point that is very important to keep in mind, and to know that we speak for people like us all over the world, and we are not separate communities around the globe, but there is a lot that brings us together and that connects us, and conversations like us, for me, it's this is the best example, and I keep using that after that along between visit to visit and between talk to talk.
I mean, some of the things that stay in my mind from my meetings with people from Breaking the Silence, B'Tselem and others here and in Israel and Palestine is the words that I took a very strong sense from that it was important for the work that is being done to push for democracy, for an end to the occupation, for peaceful coexistence, to be for those words for it to be known more broadly that fight is also happening inside of Israel, and that it was said to me in really explicit terms that it is important to take that message back to Australia and back elsewhere, so that people know that this push for peace is going on. And it's certainly something that for us here in Australia, where in general, foreign policy doesn't always rate very highly on people's sort of issues of how they will vote. For me, it's critically important. For the Greens, it's critically important that we have people like NAF, people like Tamar to talk to understand what is happening, to be able to come and amplify those voices. So I see it as very much like a symbiotic relationship in a sense. And I think that one of the things, and I see this in my electorate more broadly, like there's like Australia, we still have a pretty good democracy. It's got its faults, but we've got a pretty good democracy, and it's something that's worth defending. And one of the things I think we have to make sure that we can do is use the parliament, and I feel like I want to use the parliament to say, hey, hang on, this is happening somewhere else, and here's what the people who are there are saying, right? And here's what is being said. And so, like this is not the first time that I've spoken to Tamar, and I hope it won't be the last time either. And I think a big part of what we can do in Australia in Parliament is to try and strengthen those relationships, in part not to speak on behalf of, but to try and amplify what is being said and what is being done in other parts of the world.
So much about what NAF is acting as that channel between to show that there is hope in Israeli society. There are wonderful human rights activists, champions of democracy and equality, that these people exist. These people need our partnership and support from everywhere. And like you said, that's NAF's mission, is to amplify and fund these voices of democracy and equality as much as possible. We do have another question in the audience from Gus at the back. We'll just get the microphone to him, and Gus, you can ask your question. Go for it.
Sure. Hi, Liam. Hi, Adam and Tamar. I wanted to ask, I guess I've noticed a lot of anger, both around people my age, but just the community more broadly around, all the terrible things happening in politics and in the world, like climate crisis, the sexual assault in Canberra in the last few months, refugee issues, just so many things. And I'm wondering how you both think you as politicians, but also we as just people, can kind of convert that anger towards action and sustained action, as opposed to like drifting into apathy and feeling overwhelmed and that sort of thing.
Adam, do you want to start?
Yeah, it's two things. One is getting involved is actually good for your soul. It makes you feel better. And I don't say that glibly, like it's actually really important, because it can be really easy with the scale of the crises that we're facing to become despondent. And one of the things that keeps me going is something Bob Brown used to say, which is the people who are causing the crisis don't feel that way. They don't have those same kind of self-doubts. Like, so why should you? And it's like, it's kind of true. And it's like, I think, so getting involved and saying, no, I actually think that what is happening is wrong, I'm going to fight for some change, is actually something that does make you feel good. And I think at the moment that is important. I guess the second thing I'd say is come back to something that I said before. When I first ran, before I ran in the election, I went and spoke to a lot of people about trying to convince them to come and vote for me, for the Greens, and saying, look, we can. I felt like I had to convince them that the things the other parties were doing were wrong and that we were right and we had the better policies. I found speaking to people, they said, yeah, you're right, we agree with you, we just don't think anything we can do can make a difference. And so actually the big barrier is understanding that your vote is incredibly powerful and getting involved is incredibly powerful. And that's why I mentioned about how close this upcoming election is going to be. Like, I really feel like it's got the capacity to actually set Australia on a completely different course at this election. Like, it's only going to take, like, if we're 828 votes away from an end to majority government of the current one that we've got, like, and you look at independents are getting elected around the places in seats that previously you would have thought, oh, that's a safe seat, there's no way that would ever happen. You've got Greens, you've got others. I think there's a real chance that the next parliament could be a very interesting and very good one. And you look at all of us, perhaps probably with the exception of Bob Katter, always with the exception of Bob Katter, he's just an exception, let's put him to one side. You look at that other crossbench, the rest of the crossbench that's sitting next to me, we all actually represent different parts of Australia, and we've all got probably fairly different economic policies and in some instances different social policies, but we actually all really care about climate. Like, Zali Steggall won the seat off Tony Abbott by being more progressive than the Labor Party on climate change. Do you know what I mean? Like, people are actually up for change, are up for real change. And I think there's a real prospect that the next parliament could be one of the most exciting ones. And so part of what I want to do is say, you're actually in the box seat. Coming up to the next election, whenever it may be, you are actually in the box seat and have probably more power going into an Australian election than you've had for a very, very long time. And we could actually send the country on a completely different course to the way that it's going at the moment, which I think would be incredibly exciting.
I mean, you see how an election can change the mood of a country. You saw that in America in November, where people's minds flipped and saw what was possible. Something you said actually struck with me in the way that our Jewish community conversation is happening, that the people who are advocating or who are kind of perpetuating the climate crisis don't wake up in the morning with self-doubt. It's the same logic is applied to the Lama Bachul, like, why do you speak abroad about Israel argument, where everyone freaks out when Tamar Zandberg walks into Parliament or when Breaking the Silence walks into Parliament, but no one bats an eyelid when settlers walk in. No one bats an eyelid in the most annexationist, right-wing, even kind of racist representatives of Israeli society walk in. We need to get into this mindset that it's okay to kind of fight for these shared values that we have. So Tamar, to you now, it is such a difficult moment in Israel, internally and also with the crisis in Gaza between Hamas and Israel. How do you stay positive and how do you kind of, like Gus asked, move us to a place where we think action is possible and will actually make a difference?
Yes, I actually want to relate to what Adam said. I think that I always stay positive and I always stay optimistic. And for me, this is a strategy. It's not just a well-being. It's I would say, a psyche-politic strategy. Because I think that if you do something to affect your reality, you can never be desperate or pessimist because you are active to change it. And even if you're not successful, and let's be honest, most of the time we are not successful. But still you do something to change it, and this is why getting involved is the best advice I give to myself every morning and to all of you. And I think being involved in politics and affect your reality in any way, whether it is right or raise your voice or participate in demonstrations or vote for a party or whatever that may be, that is the best thing you can do to change your reality around you. And I think there are so many examples in history and in the reality that we see around us today, on how when enough people are organized around an action, good things can happen, even if, sometimes we don't see it very, very immediately. So I'm, as I told you, I'm right now on my way to a TV studio to raise my voice, and I visit some of the dozens of places where Jews and Arabs stand together and call against violence and for joint lives. And I'm all the time, active around our messages. And this is, I think, the best way to just know that change will come, even if it will take time.
Thank you. I think for both of you for kind of that lovely optimistic end to show that there is so much hope that we can have. So much of what NIF is about, like I said, is about amplifying these voices that we admire, and to be able to do that tonight with Tamar and Adam, and as we've done previously with this category of people we admire, of politicians, to have done it with Labour politicians, Merav Michaeli in Israel, Tanya Plibersek here. This is a kind of cross-spectrum vision of the future that we have, that is independent of political identity, that is about a shared set of values of equality and justice and democracy. So here, at least in the room, let's maybe just give a round of applause to Tamar and Adam for joining us. We have, Eve, we actually have a very small token of our appreciation for Adam, a wonderful new bag that we've created, and a logo with our friends at J Street in America, promoting this idea of shared society and equality for all. Tamar, I very much hope that once we actually start to get some vaccines in people's arms here and our borders open, maybe at some point next decade, I'll be able to come and visit you and give you a real present in person. For the moment, though,
I must tell you that one of my daughters, my baby daughters, that I was pregnant when I was there, and now she's 15 months, and one of her favorite books is the book that you gave me when I was there. Where is the green sheep?
That was all Ilana Snyder, our wonderful board chair.
She loves it, so thank you. So that's a gift, to remember. I will keep it all her life, and I will remember. I will let her know that she got it when she was still, before she was born, from friends in Australia. So thank you.
Well, you and her and Uri, you are welcome to visit, of course, whenever you like here, hopefully again soon. Thank you so much to everyone for coming. We are entering the end. I will kind of make my obligatory end of May coming into June pitch. We are entering the end of our financial year in Australia. So much of what we see on the ground happening can be changed. The impact that NIF and that Jews in Australia and our friends of Israel and Israelis and Palestinians can have is very tangible. Now is the moment we can rebuild shared society in Israel. We're going to be talking a lot about that in the coming days and weeks. There is really a crisis, like we've been talking about, inside of Israel, even as on top of the crisis that we have between Hamas and Gaza in Israel as well. Inside Israel, this crisis in shared society is real. We need to build these relationships between Jews and Arabs. There is no way that 20% of the country and 80% of the country can't get along. We have to make sure that these communities can live together side by side in peace and justice and democracy and equality. We will be talking a lot about that in the coming months. Thank you so much, everyone at home, for joining us. Thank you so much to Eve and Sharon on our team for coordinating this whole wonderful thing. I'm sorry that none of you at home can see. We have pretty much 60 incredible young professionals, youth movement madrachim, university students, an amazing community. Maybe let's all clap for ourselves here as well. This is remarkable. if the future of the Jewish community is in this room, and I know it is, the future is going to be one that is equal and inclusive and tolerant for everybody. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Adam and Tamar, again. And everyone here, the bar's about to open, so enjoy a drink. Thank you, and good night.